Hey team, and welcome to another video in the Astrological Magical Elections video series. In today's video, we're going to talk about the magical electional opportunities that are going to be available to us between the Scorpio Full Moon on May 6th and the Gemini New Moon on May 22nd. But before we really dive into that, before we go and talk about all of the magical electional opportunities that we're going to have during this time period, I wanted to talk about a thing that I kind of forgot about for a little bit. So recently we were chatting in the Patreon Discord, and I was speaking with a woman who is based in Australia and talking with her about how to relocate the charts that I share here for her location, just to make sure that she's getting kind of the closest equivalent that she can. And this is something that I might make a video on a little bit later, because while the process isn't necessarily difficult, it is kind of tricky, especially when you're kind of having to choose or prioritize between what you actually want, because things can change depending on the location. In this particular instance, because she's in Australia, which is 15 hours ahead of me, obviously it's going to be different. And so in that difference, in that time, the moon has moved 7 degrees. And so because lunar mansions are only about 13 degrees long, 7 is pretty significant difference. So in this instance, by the time you kind of reconfigured everything and got everything as closely matched to that chart as possible, the moon had actually moved into the 16th lunar mansion. So the chart that I had talked about, that was a good 15th lunar mansion for my location, and her location was actually a great 16th lunar mansion. And it reminded me that, back before, earlier on in the series, I used to do magical elections not only from the United States, but also looking from Western Europe. So I'm going to do better on that. I'm going to focus more on the electional chart opportunities from the United States, from Western Europe, and from Australia. Some good coverage, 6 hours ahead of me and 15 hours ahead of me. So the moon should be pretty well, taken care of insofar as those differences go. And it also reminded me, not only is that something that I used to do that I kind of cut back on, forgive me for my, selfishness and trying to cut corners there, but also that different places in the world will kind of have their own unique magical opportunities. And that's something that I had kind of always known because, working with people from around the globe and helping them pick electional times and ritual times and stuff, I'm aware that it's different. But I guess just kind of seeing it in that instance, and having to tell her, it's like, oh man, I hope you didn't have your heart set on this 15th lunar mansion because it's now a 16th lunar mansion, just kind of reminded me that it is different in different places, and that's something to, celebrate and explore. So we're going to do better about that. So in the spirit of that, and perhaps pretty appropriately, during this waning moon period from the Scorpio full moon into the Gemini new moon, we only have about 3 electional opportunities to talk with you about and to share with you. One of those is going to be from the United States. There aren't any from Western Europe perspective, sorry guys. And then there are going to be 2 for Australia, one of which is going to be the one that's also available in North America. And the reason for our kind of slim pickings, we'll call it, is partly due to our kind of general issues with waning moon talismans. They're a little bit more difficult to work with and to do ethical things with. But also because you probably heard, but during this 2-week period, we're going to have 3 planets turn retrograde. We're going to have Saturn on May 11th, Venus on May 13th, and then Jupiter on May 15th. So 3 planets in basically 4 days, just turning around. And when you're working with electional astrology, generally, but especially with astrological magical elections, retrograde planets are kind of impossible to work with, except for very specific circumstances that aren't something I would kind of generally advise on. You kind of can't use them. So that means that, you don't want the moon to apply to a retrograde planet. And you don't want a retrograde planet to be the ruler of the first house in a astrological magical talisman. You don't want it. So, when 3 of the 6 planets that the moon can apply to turn retrograde, you kind of, you kind of lose out on options that you can work with. So that's the part of the problem that we're working with. Also, that's really the main problem, is that we're just running out of planets that the moon can apply to for positive impact. And then, on the same hand, having Venus turn retrograde means you can't use Taurus or Libra rising charts. Having Saturn turn retrograde means no Capricorn or Aquarius rising charts. And then Jupiter turning retrograde means no Sagittarius or Pisces rising charts. So literally half the zodiac you can't have on the ascendant. And you see how it becomes a problem. But we're going to go ahead and, dive into the electional charts that I found. One of them I actually feel kind of clever about, so we'll see about that one. But our first one is set for North America on May 5th. Around 4:58 a.m. So I guess, 5 a.m. my time. And what we're looking at here is a talisman for the 23rd mansion of the moon. And the 23rd mansion is one that I don't think I've ever talked about before. It's one that I've always kind of been a bit more careful about because its energy is very consuming, literally. This mansion is referred to as the luck of the swallower. That's the translation of its Arabic name. And while it has a lot of kind of a devouring, consuming, destructive energy about it, we're going to use that for our own benefit coupled with the waning moon phase because one of the powers of the 23rd mansion is for curing illnesses. It does it in a very specific way, and it isn't something that I would recommend for preventative medicine. So if you're looking for kind of a general preventative health talisman, this is not it. This is a talisman that you would use in cures, in healing magics, that kind of thing. So if you or somebody that you know who is open to it is sick, this is a good option for you. If you don't know anybody who's sick, if you're not sick, this probably isn't going to be very helpful for you unless, I guess you can make it and then like put it to sleep and then reactivate it in a time when you are not feeling well. That's totally fine. You can do that. Okay. So let's go ahead and look at the election chart for this. Of course, we have the moon here in the 23rd mansion conjoined the midheaven. The moon, you want the moon to be angular as well as you can. And she needs to be in the mansion that you're aimed at. And here, the 23rd mansion, so we have that checked out. The lord of the first house in this chart, because we have Aries rising, is going to be Mars here in Aquarius. In the 11th house, which is a good house. The 11th house is often associated with recovery and healing, so we're definitely kind of tapping into that here as much as we can. And Mars is... We can also see Mars is unafflicted. It's not square Saturn, anything like that. The ascendant here is also not square Saturn. It can be square Mars if it wants to. It's not, but it could be because Mars rules the first house. And really the only thing that kind of afflicts the ascendant is the square to the moon, which is whatever, that's fine. So especially in healing talismans, you want to make sure, health, wellness talismans, that the ascendant, the first house, and the lord of the first house are safe from afflictions because they represent, the person for who the talisman is for. And you don't want that to be afflicted. You generally don't want it to be afflicted, but especially not in wellness because the first house has a very intimate link with health and the body. So you don't want the body to be afflicted in a talisman that's supposed to heal it. At the same time, we have the moon here in Capricorn, applying a trine to the sun in Taurus. The moon in Capricorn, it's her detriment. Typically, it's not a super great place for the moon, but there are lunar mansions and fixed stars in the sign Capricorn and Scorpio, and when that is the case, you just kind of deal with it. The debility of the moon isn't a big factor in that. It's really more accidental debilities of the moon that you're worried about, being square malefics, Caden houses, combust, conjoin the nodes, those kinds of things. That's more what you're worried about. And here the moon is, over 12 degrees separated from the node. That's really great. And not square Saturn or Mars, doing well, angular. There's not really any afflictions associated with the moon at this time. The moon's even moving quickly in this chart, so that's a bonus too. And having the moon applying any aspect with the sun, especially helpful ones like trines and sextiles, are really great in health and wellness talismans just because the sun is kind of the font of the vital and healing life force. So definitely having that symbolism woven into the chart is great. Kind of interestingly, not something I usually consider very heavily, but house positions or kind of house rulership significations in this chart are kind of interesting. Here we have Virgo on the 6th house cusp. The 6th house is, of course, the house of illness or injury or being unwell. And here we have Mercury in Taurus, conjoin the sun. And we have this kind of interesting configuration where Mercury is in actually kind of a tight square with Mars, but Mercury is separating, moving past it, which is kind of an interesting symbol for a talisman that's meant to consume or overcome illness. Like, the person was sick, now the sickness is leaving them and they're getting better. At the same time, because Mercury is so close to the sun, it's considered combust, and so Mercury is like literally consumed by the sun. So I think that's kind of interesting symbolism there. Again, not something I necessarily read too heavily into a lot of times, but for this one I just thought it was kind of neat. So that is the 23rd Lunar Mansion talisman for North America. That's the only... I'm knocking my microphone over. So this is the 23rd Lunar Mansion talisman election for North America. This is the only electional opportunity that North America is going to have during this 2-week period. And so we're kind of going to switch over to Australia at this point. So Australia will also have access to that 23rd Lunar Mansion talisman for the devouring and curing of illnesses. Theirs is going to look very, very, very similar, except it's going to be the next day. So for them, it'll be May 12th at around 4:11 a.m. And here we have the moon, of course, in the 23rd Lunar Mansion, sorry, not the 25th, that's different. And here, again, upon the midheaven, applying the trine to the sun, just like in the North American version, and everything is more or less the same. The lord of the first house is Mars, here in Aquarius in the 11th house. We still have that square here with Mercury. It's a little bit further along at this point. Mercury still combust. Mercury, the ruler of the 6th house, still in this chart as well. Mercury still combust. So that basically that same symbolism is here in the Australian chart. And I would definitely recommend making it if it's something that you're interested in doing. But Australia will also have access to a second Lunar Mansion election for this 2-week period, this one for a talisman for the 28th Lunar Mansion. And the 28th mansion is one that we've talked about several times before. We had kind of a streak for a few months where we were able to make some good ones because of the Jupiter square in late Sagittarius. But now we're going to use a little bit differently. So before, the 28th lunar mansion is kind of traditionally used to gather fish into one location and make them easy to collect. So you can use this for fishing if that's what you're into. If you like fishing or are a commercial fisherman, then the 28th lunar mansion can be used for that. Not this one, but generally it can be. So we've taken that literal physical manifestation of the talisman for the 20th Lunar Mansion about gathering fish in one location and made it into a little bit more of a metaphor where we use it more for gathering and collecting opportunities to select from, especially income generating opportunities. You don't want to do that for this one. This is a waning moon talisman, and you're more likely to kind of banish or cut off or get rid of income generating opportunities or professional opportunities, which is not something that you generally want to do, I guess, unless of course you wanted to leave your job. But we're going to do something a little bit differently. One of the other powers that is associated with the 28th Lunar Mansion is the ability to control water. What would you do? Why would you want to control water in a waning moon phase? How would that work? Well, it would be about getting rid of water or banishing water or warding off water. For what context would you want to ward off or keep water away? Flooding! So this is an opportunity actually for an anti-flooding talisman. And I'm actually not super sure about, kind of the likelihood of flooding in parts of Australia. I assume it can happen just because flooding can kind of happen anywhere. Maybe kind of, especially more so now that we're moving into winter in Australia. So, the rainy seasons. But I don't know. Hopefully this is useful. So looking at the electional chart for the talisman creation itself, we have the moon here in the 28th lunar mansion at the end of Pisces, and the lord of the first house, because the first house is ruled by Gemini, is Mercury here also in the first house in Gemini. The moon at this time will be applying a sextile to the sun. The sextile to the sun is wonderfully protective. I really appreciate the sun being in an earth sign. I like the lord of the fourth house of the land being in an earth sign. I like the lord of the fourth house being in an air sign. I'm not too proud of the moon being in a water sign, but that's just where the 20th lunar mansion is. I can't negotiate on that one. It is what that is. The sun being here in the 12th house isn't super ideal, but it's not the worst thing that could possibly happen. And there is kind of a little bit of leeway that you can have with this chart based on your own comfort, because while the lord of the first house and the ascendant and the moon are pretty well protected, insulated, they're not square Saturn, we do kind of have this loose Mars square to worry about. It's about 6 degrees away from the ascendant in this chart here. I don't consider aspects of the ascendant past 5 degrees, but for those of you who, are uncomfortable with that, who like a wider gap there, you actually can do that. If you want to, you can move the chart forward in time a little bit until, let's see, I wouldn't go past this, really. I wouldn't go past 8:30, past 11 degrees of Gemini, because by that time the moon is kind of a bit far from the midheaven. You want her to be within 5 degrees of the midheaven. But this will give you, 9 degrees at least between the Mars square and the ascendant, which can be very helpful. So something to consider, something to think about, somewhere between, say, like 8 o'clock and 8:30, ideally, would be your time frame for this talisman. So just kind of play with this ascendant and see kind of how far you want to get Mars away from it before you're more comfortable. Totally fine. So those are the magical opportunities that we have available to us during this 2-week period. Not a whole lot going on. Some interesting applications for the waning moon this time. Some interesting, more helpful ones, I hope. It's just kind of a rough time right now with everything going retrograde. Saturn and Jupiter will be retrograde well into the summer. They're retrograde, 3 months out of the year, 4 months out of the year, about 30% of the time. Venus is a bit more of a rare retrograde. Only about 7% of her orbit is retrograde, which is kind of neat. But on the more positive side of it, we have Mercury's ingress into Gemini on May 11th. And I'll do a separate video about Mercury and Gemini and taking a look through its orbit to see about potential talismanic opportunities, or kind of what that looks like, or why we don't or will have some. So look forward to that, and I will see everybody again on the Gemini New Moon.